At the beginning of our service, the choir sang an introit for us. And it was a song that many of us met for the first time when we saw the movie, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" And so it's a song that kind of reminds us of the Southern singing tradition. It was a tradition of singing when a lot of people were not literate, either musically literate or literate in general. And so singing was much less a matter of reading the words and reading the notes out of a hymnal, as much as it was just more or less remembering the song, listening to one another, and singing together. So I'm going to invite you to do that, even now. I did cheat a little bit. I put the lyrics in the bulletin. We're going to sing this song, "Down to the River." And because it comes out of that oral tradition before the written tradition, it appears in many different forms. And the lyrics are different at times. So we're going to go with these lyrics for now. You can make up your own as you go along. Sing it with me. As I went down to the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sisters, let's go down, come on down. Oh, brothers, let's go down to the river to pray. And see, at this point, you don't know if we're going to keep singing or not. So you're listening for the leader, and you're not rushing the leader. As I went down to the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Suddenly you're filled with the Spirit. Whoa, sisters, let's go down, come on down. Oh, brothers, let's go down to the river to pray. Oh, sisters, let's go down, won't you come on down? Oh, brothers, let's go down to the river to pray. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over into Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. We set sail for Troas, took a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day to Neapolis, from there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. And the Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized in the river, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. This ends the reading. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me?
Studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way.
God of grace, take us to the river. Let your waters flow over us and make us new. Amen. So we began the service, and I asked you to think about a time in your life where you had that moment when it seemed like everything came together, or maybe it was a moment when suddenly it made sense to you, some kind of moment where your own life was transformed. I asked you to do that because in some ways, when we have a moment like that, it becomes the thing we have to share with others. So I have a very nefarious plot here today. I'm going to reveal it to you right now, and that is I'm going to invite you to lean into that moment in such a way that you will become a person that can help others to find that moment in their life. If this were not a Presbyterian church, we might call it evangelism, but we don't say that word around here, apparently, so we're not going there. We're just going to say that I'm going to invite you to lean into that moment to where you can become a vehicle by which others can find that moment in their life. And I'm going to do it in a way that may sound kind of pop psychology-like, and I don't care. This is how we're going to do it this morning. First thing I'm going to invite you to do is to fully embrace that moment. And what I mean by that is don't let anybody take away your moment by telling you it's not orthodox or it's not correct or it didn't happen the right way or anything like that. Your moment is authentically your moment, whether it fits anybody else's mold or not. So I invite you to fully embrace that just the way you remember it. And then to go a little bit deeper, I want you to think about where others were involved in that moment. Because while we have these tremendous moments that feel intensely personal, they're never truly private. There's always somebody else involved, somebody preparing us, somebody who's making this way possible for us. So as you think about that moment in your life where you had that kind of breakthrough, and maybe it was a moment when you hit bottom and knew there was only one way up, or maybe it was a moment when suddenly it all just opened up for you in the middle of nowhere. When you think about that moment, I also invite you to think about others who were affecting you, who were affected by that moment, the community around you that we often forget. And finally, in order to fully embrace this moment, there's not only the uniqueness and the authentic moment you have, there's not only the community, but start imagining the ways that God was present in that moment. And the Christian church has really struggled, not just the Christian church, but religions throughout the world have struggled to find language to name how it is that God's involved in our lives, even in those moments where we scarcely recognize it. And probably just in retrospect, we can look back and say, that was a God moment. But imagine that moment, how God prepared you for that, how God was mysteriously at work in your life. That's what I mean when I invite you to embrace that moment in all of its fullness. This is the God moment. And this is your story, it's God's story, it's the story of others. And I invite you to embrace it as just that, a story that means so much to you that you would be more than happy to share it with others. So the second thing I'm going to invite you to do with that story is to let go of it. And I realize that seems counterintuitive to what I just said, seems contradictory to what I just said. But the reason we want to let go of it is because we don't want to become the people who only have one orthodox way of how God works in people's lives. And we want to open up the possibility that God could be at work in someone else's life in an entirely different way. So while our experience means a lot to us, we want to hold it very lightly so that we can be open to other ways that God might be present in people's lives. This is like the number one downfall of Christianity, I think, is we think our experience is the template. And we're going to struggle against that. So we embrace our experience, but we hold it very lightly. The purpose of embracing this experience and learning to hold it lightly is so that we might be a means by which others can have that very kind of moment. And that's where I want you to remember our scripture reading today. It's a really great text where the Apostle Paul has seen a vision from someone in Macedonia. This is the area north of Greece, and is begging him to come over and help us. The man in the vision says, come help us. So this is when the gospel goes from the Mediterranean area over into Europe for the first time. And the Apostle Paul goes there, and you heard me name several cities that they went through. And they landed in a city called Philippi, which is described by the narrator as being a Roman colony. So this is a thoroughly Romanized city there in Macedonia. And I think one of the reasons it's described like that is because it's a city that apparently has no synagogue. And Paul's typical method in his missionary journeys was to go to a city, go into the synagogue, and there start sharing the gospel that he had. There's no synagogue in Philippi, apparently. And so on the Sabbath day, instead of going to the synagogue, Paul and his companions do something very, very brilliant. They go outside of the city, down to a river, where you heard the phrase, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And it's there, at the river, that Paul and his companions encounter a woman named Lydia and her companions. And that's where this sharing of stories, this transformative moment happens. And I want to invite you to think of 3 different ways this could have happened. The narration is kind of sparse, and it leaves a lot of gaps, which means we get to fill them in. And we're going to do that this morning. We're going to think of 3 different possibilities of what's going on here at the river. And the first possibility, and the most popular way of reading this text, and if I were pressed to it, I'd think this is probably the most likely way that the text is pointing, is that Lydia and her companions are also Jewish, or Jewish in some way, maybe Jewish converts. And they too have no synagogue in the city of Philippi where they are, and they go down to the river because within the Jewish tradition, the river is often seen as a sacred place. And so lacking a synagogue, this is where they go. And it's there that Paul encounters these faithful people who, like him, are looking for a space to worship the living God. And because Paul shares that history and that language and those common repository of stories with them, he's able to simply share the things they know. When he talks about Jesus as the Messiah, they have a working understanding of what that might be. When he talks about the prophets, they know exactly who he's talking about. When he appeals to the covenant with Abraham, they're living in that covenant. So one way that this encounter could be happening by the river is that Paul is sharing with someone who shares with him a very similar faith tradition. And in doing so, he can draw on the language and the experience. And that's how God opens up Lydia's heart, and she welcomes the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's one way of reading the story. We might also imagine, though, that maybe Lydia is not Jewish. She's described by the narrator as being a God-fearer. It's a curious term that's only used in the book of Acts, and we're not entirely sure exactly what it means. It's somebody who more or less worships the same God as the Jews, but hasn't necessarily become a Jewish convert, is often how it's used. And that's how Lydia is described. So the second possibility is that Paul goes down to the river, supposing it to be a place of prayer, and Lydia is down by the river from a different faith tradition. Because in many different religious traditions, the river is a sacred place. In fact, I would say by today, Christianity has gotten so distant from the river that in more religions that are not Christian than Christian religions, the river continues to be a sacred place. So this could be an encounter between the Apostle Paul with his faith in Jesus Christ and Lydia and her friends who are worshipers of the divine in a sacred space, but not necessarily from the same religion. And if that's the case, boy, there's a lot going on whenever the narrator says, we sat down and we spoke to them. Because you can't rely on Christian terminology. You can't expect that I can say the prophets and they know who I'm talking about. You can't take shortcuts when we tell our story. We have to find a new language, an authentic but a different language for sharing our story. And for Paul to connect with Lydia there, for the Holy Spirit to kind of make some synergy happen between the two of them, Paul now has to sacrifice some of his familiar rhetoric in order to express his story authentically, anew. And I'm going to suggest that that is exactly what Christian people need to do today in order to take that experience that has changed our lives so much and to communicate with people where we can no longer simply accept that everyone lives more or less within Christendom. And in doing so, the Apostle Paul will find a language that he and Lydia might share. They might have different images with the word God, but they may both really be devoted to some kind of powerful meaning and purpose in the world. So the second scenario is that maybe by the river, there may be the place for us to share our story and enable others to have that moment, is the place where we have to lay down some of our usual rhetoric and learn to express our story in a new, authentic way. And the third possibility is, Lydia and her friends might be down by the river not worshiping at all. The narrator tells us that Paul and his companions supposed that there'd be a place of prayer by the river, but it doesn't really say that's exactly why Lydia was there. Lydia was, in fact, a manufacturer of dye, a very expensive purple dye, a very rare thing. So she was kind of a high-end textile merchant in some ways. And if she wasn't Jewish, it may not be her Sabbath. And if she's not Jewish and it's not her Sabbath, they might be at the river simply washing the garments so you can set the dye. In other words, there's nothing in this story that absolutely demands that she's down there for a religious experience. She might just be going about her business. And yet, when Paul encounters someone going about their business, there's still something about that faith experience that we have that can be communicated. Because people who are going about their business are living with purpose. People going about their business, they still find meaning in the world. They're still longing for hope. They're still longing for life to make sense. They're still longing for something that looks like justice in the world. They're still longing for acceptance. They're still longing for peace, for hope. And so imagine now the possibility that when Paul goes down to the river and they encounter Lydia and these women, they're not really there for a religious moment at all. And let's just not even call it religious. Let's just say that authentic lives encounter one another. And maybe there's not Bible study and there's not prayer and there's not kind of theological dialogue, but maybe there's a kind of acceptance and a kind of civility, a kind of welcome, kind of radical hospitality taking place that is notably different than the kind of stuff we usually run into when we're going about our business. Another possibility of this story is that Paul and his companions encounter people who are simply going about their business. But because they've had this experience in their life that has been radically transformative for them, it renews them. Notice how Lydia responds. She gets baptized, she and her whole household, and then the first thing she does is she looks at Paul and his companions and says, if you count me worthy, you can stay at my house. I would be happy to host you. Whatever happened to her down by the river, the way she embraces it is by opening her doors and making her life more accepting of others. So I invite you to take that experience you've had in your life, to plumb it deeply, so that you can appreciate not only what it means for you and what it meant for you, what it continues to mean for you, but also who else was involved and how it's radiated throughout the community of your life. And I invite you to consider it in a way where you are very aware of how God, in all these mysterious moments, somehow brought this about. Because I invite you to take that story and let it transform you into the kind of person who can enable others to find that thing for which their heart has longed and desired. And may God give us the grace to bear that kind of story. Amen.